For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here to talk about the offshore today. We've got Erik Milit with us. He's the president of the National Ocean Industries Association, aka NOIA, and we're delighted to have him. He's a returning guest, but Erik, it's been way too long since we talked to you and talked to the world about what's going on in the offshore. There's been a lot of developments, so thank you so much for joining us. We're excited.
Yeah, thanks for having me. There's been a lot going on, and I'm excited to share it with you.
Well, and you're sitting there in Washington, D.C., and there's just nothing going on there these days. So I'm sure we'll be bored to tears, I'm sure, with just nothing happening in our nation's capital. Thanks for putting up with my jokes, Erik. We are delighted to have you. Mike, speaking of things going on, how's the screen today? What would you tell our listeners and viewers about that?
Yeah, Maynard, today the screen is a little bit green. You got the Dow up around 300 or 400 points. You have bond yields down a little bit on a cooler than expected PPI number this morning, and you have crude oil down about $1.50 to $2, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's just kind of giving you a wrap up of what last week looked like. I mean, we said this a million times, but last week was really about volatility, and the other word was reversal. Everything plunged on Monday, be it bond yields, Nikkei, U.S. equities, et cetera, and they all reversed by the end of the week. And so, one of the reasons that is because of concerns of you obviously had the yen carry trade was unwinding, but you still have this issue of what's the Fed going to be doing. And so, like I said earlier this morning, you had PPI come out cooler than expected, so bond yields are down. You have CPI will be reported tomorrow, and then you have initial jobless claims and retail sales on Thursday. So pretty heavy economic week, so expect a little bit more volatility here over the next couple of days. If those economic numbers come in a little cooler than expected, then the Fed's going to have the green light to cut rates beginning in September. Now on the crude oil point, we're down about $2 today, but over the last 4 or 5 trading days, we're up around $6 to $7 a barrel. A couple of reasons, and it's really been about supply. Right, people are concerned of what's going to happen with crude oil as Iran retaliates against Israel. I think traders have basically gone from a net long position to a net neutral, are looking to get net short, but they want to see what happens there. And the second thing that's happened here is that you had Russia basically, or Ukraine, had an incursion into Russia, and so that's created a little bit of a concern from a supply standpoint as well. What's got crude oil down here over the last day or so is just demand. We saw, on Monday, it was Monday, we saw essentially OPEC lower their demand estimates for 2024, and that's the first time we've seen that. Today we came out with the IEA, who was way lower than them from a demand standpoint on 24 and 25. Talk a little bit more bearish, so that's not a surprise. So those two dynamics has really got crude oil down. The last thing I really want to talk about is the copper markets. We haven't talked about this in quite a bit of time, and instead of talking offshore, we're doing a little bit onshore here. But what we saw today is that BHP's mine called Escondida is going down because there's a strike there. And the reason that's important, it's the largest mine in the world. It's roughly 5% of world copper capacity or world copper mine, and so that going down is obviously going to help create some inventory issues that have popped up over the last couple of weeks. LME inventories that are near historic highs, and so that's really kind of weighed on copper prices. They were over $10,000 a metric ton. They came down about $9,000 to $9,000 a metric ton, and now they're starting to move up because this is a big mine that's gone down. Remember, we talked about a year and a half ago about the Cobre mine in Panama that went down temporarily. Now it's closed sort of permanently. That was 300,000 metric tons. This one is 1 million metric tons. So it's a big guy, and so we're getting a little bit of a copper movement today. And so we just wanted to end it with that. That's something that we really haven't talked about. So we'll hand it back to you, Maynard.
Yeah, really interesting, Mike. Jeff, as we jump in with Erik, anything on your mind that you would share?
Yeah, as we get started with Erik, today forced me to go back and think about Gulf of Mexico activity. And so just to set the stage there, early in my career as a young research analyst, we hit the peak in Gulf of Mexico rig count. Baker Hughes rig count shows that at 176. relative to the about 20 that we're at today. I don't remember that number being right. I mean, I know there's a difference between active rigs and what Baker shows. I want to say there was 180 jackups running and about a little over 200 total rigs running in the Gulf of Mexico at the peak in '01. We're down about 90% from that over that 23, 24 years. Yet oil production still resilient at a couple million barrels a day. So it definitely outkicks its relevance, because so much of the world gets caught up in just drilling and completion activity. But the Gulf of Mexico's relevance to the oil and gas picture is still really impactful. And I'm sure we'll talk about it today, Maynard. But as we think about the future, and as the onshore starts to mature, just the different regulatory profile, risk profile, skill set, emissions profile of offshore and onshore will come back a little bit more into focus. So I look forward to talking about that today.
Awesome. That's amazing that we had that many rigs running 20 plus years ago. Well, Erik, fantastic to have you. I'm trying to think where to jump in. I think one place to just state up front is the National Ocean Industries Association. You're all flavors. I mean, if it's happening offshore, it could be wind, it could be solar, it could be anything, and of course oil and gas, minerals, etc. That's where your industry association gets involved. I know we'll end up talking a fair amount about oil and gas, of course, but in your world, maybe one place to start, what have been the big issues in the last year or so? Like, how have you been spending your time? What's been pulling on you? What are your members? What have been the agitating or otherwise exciting issues in the offshore?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great transition into my conversation, because the Gulf of Mexico really is kind of a forgotten, booming region for the country and for the world. 2 million barrels a day is not insignificant, and we as the National Ocean Industries Association spend a lot of our time as the advocate for the industry, making sure that we have favorable policies related to leasing, permitting, and regulation, and we cover oil and gas, wind. Carbon capture and storage is an area where we'd like to see the government get moving, because there's a lot of promising projects that could come online there. And we're also working in minerals. So we have a lot going on, and we represent the full supply chain. So about a third of our membership would be the operators, the project developers, the leaseholders, and then the other 2/3 would be the companies that are involved in constructing, operating, and maintaining the projects. And what's common across all these different energy sources is just the mere fact that it's marine construction. So the companies that provide the vessels for an offshore oil and gas type of project also can provide the vessels for a wind project or a carbon storage project. And the geological aspects are similar when it comes to the seismic research that's needed. We have vast amounts of seismic data in the Gulf of Mexico that has led the industry to understand that it is a highly prospective region for storing carbon dioxide. So we have a real cacophony of companies working together across all these different types of energy sources, and that are able to leverage that expertise in engineering, in project management, in geophysical science to make sure that we here in the U.S. can be ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to a lot of these advancing technologies.
I was thinking, Erik, just scanning my own impressions of the offshore over the last 12 to 18 to 24 months. One story seems like is that offshore wind has really been struggling, either because something was no longer economic and it was getting canceled, or it was getting rebid, or there've been some incidents with problems, physical problems. What would you say about offshore wind and its activities and the outlook and just the enthusiasm around that space? And maybe my impression is, that's just how it's been feeling here at Barrington, but what would you say about offshore wind?
Well, there's absolutely been bumps in the road, but I think when you have an emerging sector like that in a new region here in the U.S., you're going to run into some of these issues any time that you're establishing a new base of operations. There's going to be some hiccups like that, but that was compounded by the issues with inflation surrounding the supply chain interest rates. A lot of companies were still depending on debt and leveraging that to bring a lot of these projects online. And so all this kind of came together, and you have a significant competition at this point. You've got lots of companies looking to bring on lots of different projects all at the same time. So there needs to be a cascading of projects so that we can take advantage of all the service and supply companies and resources that are going to be needed for these projects. We've seen with this administration, an administration that's very bullish on offshore wind. They have a goal of seeing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's ambitious, but it's better to be more ambitious than less ambitious when it comes to getting these types of industries up and running. They've already approved, I think, 9 or 10 specific projects. Their goal was to have 16 approved by 2025. So they're on track for that. And with the leasing, they've continued to push the lease sales out. Now, a lot of this comes down to public policy. Veriton, of course, is focused on market dynamics and making sure you're getting out to your clients and the investment community with the best information based on the market. But a lot is happening in Washington that's impacting the ability to invest in all these energy sources, oil and gas, wind, as well as carbon sequestration. And we at NOIA have been able to have some success, particularly for oil and gas, but also for wind and carbon storage, to make sure that the government is enabling rather than restricting a lot of these projects. And the greatest deal of success we've had has been with oil and gas. When I talked to you last time, it was April of 2021, just a few months after President Biden announced they were going to pause offshore oil and gas lease sales. And at that point, we didn't know how things would shake out, but the president kind of stuck to that. But we were able to overcome it in our work with Congress in a bipartisan way, and working with Senator Manchin out of West Virginia, who's a Democrat, but who's been reasonable.
So the lease sales, that's another thing that sticks out, is just the friction we've had in the system around lease sales. Where does that sit now? And could you give us just a feel, the Biden administration, the lease sales compared to either the historical numbers, or help us compare and contrast the amount of lease sale activity that's happened this administration versus others?
No, it's a great question, and it's a striking contrast. I was looking back historically. The first leasing program was with President Carter. It was supposed to be 80 to 85. You had these programs are to cover 5 years and the entire Outer Continental Shelf. There's over 20 leasing areas, and the original leasing program, when they first put forth in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act a requirement to have a program, actually had 36 lease sales. The next one had 41. The next one had 42. Then you saw it to start to drop down to 18, 16, 20. And then the last one out of the Obama administration had 11 lease sales. So then that one ended in 2022.
Sorry, Eric, those are just the number of actual lease sales? That's not leases.
Lease sales.
Right. Okay.
The way the statute is set up, it requires the government to put a schedule of lease sales that covers the 5-year period. The most recent 5-year period before the Biden administration came in was the 2017 to 2022 program, and it had 11 lease sales included in the schedule. Ultimately, only 4 of those lease sales were held. Now, you could have a lot scheduled, and oftentimes they won't have all of them, but you want to make sure you're creating the best opportunities for investment by being as inclusive and expansive as possible. And then we saw the first delay. In July of 2022, the new administration, the Biden administration, did not put in a new program to follow up the old one. So they came out with that at the end of 2023, and that program began in 2024 and ends in 2029. So we basically went 2 years without a program being in place at all, in complete violation of the statute. And this new leasing program that runs from 24 to 29 has a total of 3 lease sales, all in the Gulf of Mexico, 1 in 25, 1 in 27, and 1 in 29. So it's the smallest amount of leases ever offered and scheduled in a leasing program ever in history. And this year will be the first time since 1958 that the federal government will not hold an offshore lease sale. So that's 66 years. It's incredible. This is conventional production. You need the opportunity to get out there and explore and discover resources. And when you don't have leases, you don't have the acreage you want, and it becomes harder and harder to make those discoveries to kind of replenish and build on the production we have in the Gulf.
Erik, I didn't mean to. I've touched a problem here early in the discussion. What is the stated policy goal of not having these lease sales? Like if we had if the administration was here defending itself, what would they say is the reason why we're not going to have a lease sale?
Yeah, I would expect there to be two sides to that response. One would be energy transition, shift to renewables and clean energy, and a move away from fossil fuels. And when we work with the government, whether it's Congress, the administration, we like to bring things back to reality. We look at the data. We see that 2023 was around 102 million barrels a day of demand throughout the global economy. This year, it's going to be 102 to 104. Next year, likely to increase. So our response to that is always that we in the U.S. are in the best position to produce this energy in the cleanest, most environmentally and safest way. And we actually came out with new data on that. We at NOIA contracted ICF to put out a study on carbon intensity of production from all the regions of the world. And it's clear this was something we kind of knew ahead of that time, but we wanted to get some data out into the public about the carbon intensity of oil from all over the world. And, Gulf of Mexico production has about 46% less carbon intensity than the average barrel from outside the world. So that's a big winner. But beyond that, it's the point that the U.S. can continue to be ahead of the rest of the world in technology advancement, in creating these high-paying jobs. The Gulf of Mexico supports 370,000 jobs, and that we are generating money from the Gulf of Mexico through the revenues that come in that is dedicated to land and water conservation fund. It's dedicated to parks and recreation in the inner cities. It's dedicated to our national parks. Without offshore, you don't have that. So we have all these benefits we point to. So we need to focus on that. And the other, which is a bit of a red herring, and it's a argument that is very misleading, is that we have enough leases, we have enough acreage. And the last thing we want is the government to be deciding where the oil and gas is, because the best companies to find that out and to determine that are the oil and gas companies that have the success in doing that. And we're still in an industry where we're wildcatting. I think globally you'll see maybe 3/4 of these wells that are drilled at $100, $200 million a well still might come up dry. But the Gulf of Mexico still is highly prospective. I think just behind, Guyana, the Gulf of Mexico stands number 2 when it comes to discoveries. And the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of major projects coming on. And just this week, we saw Chevron coming online with first oil from Anchor, which is the first project of its kind with, a 20K project where you're getting into the higher pressure, higher temperature regions. But we've got lots of good projects coming on, and we have production 1.8 million barrels a day, and we think we can get up to 2.4, 2.5 million barrels a day, but that requires the government to kind of get out of the way and give us those opportunities.
Yeah, the point about the money made for the Treasury, if this activity happens, even if you're not a fan of the activity, this is a lot of capital that could come, and we're spending like crazy, so we could use it. Well, I guess that ends up being a comment, not a question. But how about just the water depths and the technology? It seems like in the history, Jeff was going back to, 24 years ago when we were peaking, 23-ish years ago, and we were always pushing out to deeper and deeper depths. Is that still going on? What would you tell us about your community's just the technology advancement that you're seeing and what's exciting in the space right now.
Yeah, that's largely what has happened. We're at the point now where I believe 92% of production comes from deep water, about 8% from the shelf or shallow water. And the shelf still provides a lot of oil. We have companies that are, I think our most active companies from a drilling standpoint are in the shallow water on the shelf. And that is meaningful production. Companies like Iranian and Cantium are out there kind of leading the way and doing a lot of tiebacks and using existing fields to bring wells into the existing facilities and enhance and improve production on the shelf. But 92% of production does come from deep water. And you look at the projects that are coming online, they're getting into these frontier regions where you're requiring the sophisticated equipment, the materials to make sure we can withstand the environments where you're going to potentially face 20,000 pounds per square inch of pressure and the high and those high temperatures. We've got Anchor's the first one, but Beacon's got Shenandoah coming on, BP with Cascada, and then Shell with Sparta. You have all those coming on over the next few years. Those are projects that are 60,000, 75,000, potentially to 100,000 barrels a day each. And then you have a lot of other projects, LOG, the Salamanca project, and then, Telos has, they had first oil at the end of 2023 in their Venice and Lime Rock projects coming online. So most of this is in deeper water, 4, 5, 6,000 feet, probably 30 to 35,000 total depth from the production facility to the targeted wells where you're producing the oil from. So that's been the big shift. And you've seen that in the number of facilities. We got lots of facilities getting decommissioned. You were at 3,000 to 4,000 facilities a few decades ago, and now you're probably down to 1,000 or 1,200. And you probably have 800 to 900 still producing. So it has changed a lot, but you can do a lot more with a lot less. It's one of the reasons why you have the low carbon footprint and the smaller physical environmental footprint. I think one of the data points we had coming from Scott Angel when he was a director of BOEM up here at Interior was that you've got 18 facilities producing 75% of the oil in the Gulf of Mexico. That's more oil than the entire state of North Dakota. So you can do a lot with less for sure, based on the amount of oil you get out per well and per facility these days in the Gulf of Mexico.
Erik, you mentioned earlier about you've had a half a dozen or so wind farm approvals over the last couple of years. You've got probably anywhere from 6 to 10 waiting for approval as well. You've had a lot of turnover in those wind farm ownership. I mean, some of these U.S. utilities have pulled out of that because that's what shareholders wanted them to do. And I'm curious here. You just had this, this wind, this turbine blade basically up on the Vineyard Farm prospect up in Nantucket. Obviously in the ocean. I guess my question is that a lot has happened over the last couple of years, and I'm not going to describe this as sort of a Macondo event for the wind turbine business, but it's gotten a lot of press of late. How do you think that's affecting sort of maybe the approvals going forward? Are we relooking at this, at the potential for stuff like this to happen? Is there a pause going on? Are people rethinking? Where are we now with these new projects today versus where we were a couple of years ago? Because it just seemed like they wanted to crank them out as quickly as possible, and now you're realizing it's not as easy as possible. Obviously, inflation affected some of these projects. You've had turnover. What are you seeing today, and where do you think this is in a couple of years from now?
Well, there's been a bit of a reset because of the economics, as I mentioned, when you're looking at the supply chain, inflationary impacts, and you're looking at the impacts from the rising interest rates and that side of the house. But you have a lot of very sophisticated international companies that are leading the way, companies like Ørsted and Equinor and Total Energies that have a lot of experience building and constructing and operating these types of projects throughout the world, particularly in Europe. Europe has been leading the way. They have an established offshore wind sector, and it's just taken some time for us to get this industry built here in the U.S. and up and running. There's a need for vessels, there's a need for ports, there's a need for workers, but the industry as a whole has been working very hard to make all that happen. They've been working with local communities, and it's unfortunate when you see something like that happen with the blade separating, but it's something we'll be able to get over. It's a rare incident, and these are circumstances that you learn from and you move beyond. When I think of the oil and gas industry, whether it's onshore shale or offshore, we run into issues and we put our best minds to it and we overcome them and we make sure it doesn't happen again. So I'm fairly confident that's what we're going to see in the offshore side of the house. And from everything that we see from the companies that have invested in these projects and have the leases, they're moving forward with them. And it's going to take a few years because it takes a long time to construct a project like this in the offshore setting, but they're all going to be coming online, and we may not see 30 gigawatts. As I said, that's ambitious by 2030, but we're going to see the projects continue to come online. And when you think about a new type of activity, after it gets established and after you have it up and running for a while, the public then gets to be more and more comfortable with it. We've seen that in the Appalachian area. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and I go back home, and the shale development was something a bit new, but the public is firmly behind it. You've seen that in the presidential election now with everybody battling over who's opposed to fracking and who's not. Apparently, you need to be for it if you want to win Pennsylvania, but that's because over the past 10, 12 years, the people in Pennsylvania have gotten to understand and know and learn about it, and they fully support it because it's provided that huge economic boost to that region, and it's provided a lot of good, high-paying jobs. And we're going to see similar type of activity, along the coastlines where we see these wind projects coming up, and it's something that's an impact, lots of different aspects of those communities, and that includes universities and research and the different types of construction that we're going to be seeing coming online. So it's positive all around, but you're going to have opponents. You have Not in My Backyard, and you have a New England area, which is got a fairly wealthy vacationing contingent there that doesn't want to see these. The good news is these wind projects are being built pretty far away, and at the most they may look to be maybe a centimeter, or you won't see them at all, and they're being spread out fairly well to make sure that we're making accommodations for commercial fishing and marine navigation. So a lot of thought's been going into it, and we're optimistic that it's going to make its way through with support over time.
The other thing that's interesting to me, and you hit on it a little bit, is like the service industry, right? I mean, especially for the wind, it's really not developed yet. And about the only vessel that I can see out there that's being constructed is Dominion's constructing a vessel for offshore wind, and it's a huge vessel, and it's going to come on, I guess, in the next 12, 18 months. How do you see this industry developing, the offshore wind industry from a service standpoint? Does it really have to have these projects up and running? Is it kind of like you just said, West Africa? There was no market there. Now there's a service of a pretty robust service market. How do you see that kind of developing here over the next couple of years?
No, it's a great question because we have companies in our membership, companies like Ares Marine. They're an offshore service vessel company. They've opened up an office in Cape May, New Jersey. They have lift boats, and they've already used their lift boats for projects like Block Island Wind and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, offshore Virginia, where they're assisting in the cable laying for these projects, where you're connecting the cables between turbines and to the offshore electrical substations that end up tapping into the grid onshore. And that's a difficult decision to make because you want to see a robust sector up and running so that these investments will pay off for companies like that. So it's a bit of a cat and a mouse, chicken egg type of situation. You want to be ahead so that you're there to be able to get the business, but you don't want to be too far ahead that you're potentially sacrificing too much that could impact your business. But our companies, they see it as a growth opportunity. It's additive. They've been in oil and gas for a long time. Gulf Island Fabrication. They've fabricated a lot of the offshore facilities for the Gulf of Mexico. They put together the jackets for the 5 turbines in the Rhode Island wind farm. Subsea 7. I'm sure you're familiar with. They do a lot of the work on the subsea infrastructure for oil and gas. They've been up there helping to lay cables and do that type of work. The seismic companies have been very busy mapping out the Atlantic, and they're the same ones that built up the database for oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's challenging, and it does take a while. And as these projects get moving and the demand grows for the service and supply companies, I think you'll see them committing more and more to being part of that. But it is a tough decision to make when your history and your experience have been in oil and gas in the Gulf.
Erik, I wanted to turn to one micro issue that caught our attention over the last few months is around, particularly in the shallow water platform and well abandonment. There was a bankruptcy of a private company, and seeing who ultimately will bear that liability. Maybe could you just talk about the platform abandonment liability issues as well as ongoing insurance issues in the Gulf of Mexico? Those are just two of the issues that kind of caught my eye lately.
Yeah, those are issues. There's lots of issues there, though. It's hard to just define them to two. And there's two different sets. You've got oil spill liability coverage that you're required to get. There's been a little bit of a shakeup on the insurance side there, and companies fortunately have various ways to be able to demonstrate oil spill responsibility. So the larger companies, the multinationals, the majors, they're able to self-insure for either oil spill liability or for plugging and abandonment, decommissioning, financial assurance. But you have smaller companies that up to this point have, for oil spill liability, have generally used insurance. That market's gotten a little tight, but there are other ways that they've been able to demonstrate that. They've been able to do it through a combination of insurance, self-insurance, using your balance sheets, bonding, sureties, treasuries, things like that. So that was a bit of a hiccup, but so far it hasn't held things up. That was a bit of a new item that came up basically out of the U.S. Coast Guard, how they're dealing with some older liabilities related to some older spills that occurred a long way back. With the decommissioning, that's a tricky issue as well. We represent majors, we represent independents, and they're obviously not always on the same page. So we've been a bit neutral on that, but the government has changed its approach to the way it's requiring companies to demonstrate financial assurance for decommissioning, and they're really focusing on the risk of the asset and the risk of the company that is operating the facility. And they're looking at the investment grade of the company and then looking at all that and determining whether or not there should be supplemental bonding put in place. That, I think, is in litigation. I think some of the companies that don't like that approach are suing over that. The way it's been managed in the past has been that if you're a smaller company and you're in a chain of title and you go bankrupt, or you're not able to handle the decommissioning liabilities, they go back through the chain of title, and the government will go after whoever it can find that previously held the lease and seek the plugging and abandonment costs from them, or get them to do it. And that's just the way the leasing regime has worked. You get a lease, it's joint and several liability, such that if you sell it, you kind of always retain some level of exposure. But those companies that sell the assets and the government have all been trying to find different ways to, I guess, address that, to make it a bit of a different regime moving forward. So it's a bit complicated, but there's a lot going on there. And I will add that there is a press from the government to actually make sure most of the steel comes out of the water. And then you also have the Rigs to Reef program, where you have a lot of these structures that have turned into ecosystems that scuba divers go out to, that fishermen go out to, and that have the potential to be artificial reefs. And that's another area where the states work to make sure that they can continue to utilize those in the Rigs to Reef program. So I went off in a lot of different directions, but it's going in a lot of different directions.
It was a pretty. I wanted to ask a question where you could take it anywhere. I think on the positive side, in terms of the decommissioning, it seems to have created a boom for the companies doing the decommissioning work. Is that a business that is starting to attract more capital? Because it certainly feels like a growth market here over the next little while, as the government is pressing for the decommissioning to actually occur versus kind of just being pushed to the right.
Yes, that's accurate. There has been growing demand for companies that can take on the decommissioning responsibilities in terms of being the contractor to get out there to do the work and remove the steel from the ocean. So we have seen that, and we expect that to be a part of the industry that continues to see a lot of business.
So Erik, you mentioned fishing there with the rigs to reef, and what is the interaction like with the quote fishing industry? I assume there's a fishing industry association as well. Like how do you interact with those guys? What would you tell us about that relationship? It's just interesting.
Well, the Gulf of Mexico has been a story of happy coexistence. In many respects, the platforms and facilities in the Gulf of Mexico are the reason why you have such a big red snapper population in the Gulf. It's because they were able to see these artificial reefs grow and flourish, which created an ecosystem for the red snapper population to grow. And that's one of the top dishes you'll see in the restaurants along the Gulf Coast there. So there's really been no conflict. And as we've seen in the past, we've actually reached out to the fishing community when we've been looking to build support for a robust offshore leasing program and support for Gulf of Mexico oil and gas activity, because they recognize that is a place sometimes where they'll stop and they'll get bait to go further out to get the bigger fish that they're trying to pull in for the market. So it's been a huge success, and it's been a good story. And the Gulf of Mexico overall, when you're looking at the military, you're looking at tourism, you're looking at commercial and recreational fishing, everything coexists very well, and we haven't seen conflict. And I think that is the example that we need to look at when you're looking at other regions, that we find a way to work together and support each other, because all these different industries along the coastline then are able to, boost each other when it comes to the just economies of scale and what they can do to support each other, along the coastline. If you got a big energy industry, you got a lot of people to go to restaurants and buy the fish and eat the food, and to go out on the weekends and do the same thing. And it's been a real positive aspect of what we've seen in the Gulf of Mexico all around. And the employees and the executives and everyone that works in the offshore Gulf of Mexico industry, they're all outdoorsmen, they're all fishermen, they all got boats, they all do the same thing. It's like one community. I hate to separate them.
So I guess I was just thinking, Erik, as you were talking about all that, what role do the states play in your world? Like Texas and Louisiana, those are obviously two super important states to all this activity. Those coasts on the northeastern, the states on the northeastern seaboard, you mentioned New Jersey, they have a lot to do, a lot at stake as it relates to wind. What role did the state governments or the state's economic alignment, how does that show up in your world?
It plays a huge role. And one of the reasons why we're still active and we have a strong presence in the Gulf of Mexico is because Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, those four states are huge supporters of our industry. There are thousands of companies that work in support of our industry. And, most of those companies are along the Gulf Coast, but we actually have vendors in every state in the nation that get checks and get business from the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas sector. But most of those employees, most of those companies are in those four states. Texas has the most, Louisiana second, and then Mississippi and Alabama are there. But those communities have a lot of people working and have a lot of companies, and we have companies throughout Florida that are also working in support. Some companies are manufacturing umbilicals and risers that are out of Florida, and other companies that provide a lot of the marine equipment that we use. So even Florida, we've had a bipartisan presence there when you're looking at their congressional representation. They've pushed back against expanding development along their shoreline, but that's not what the industry is actually looking at. If you see the progression of development for oil and gas projects in the Gulf of Mexico, it's kind of grown and expanded to what we call the Central Eastern Gulf boundary. So we have access to the Western Gulf, we have access to the Central Gulf, and the Eastern planning area is kind of off limits at this point. But you're looking at an area that's 150, 175 miles away from Florida, where we could potentially expand and get some more projects online. And that way, those Gulf Coast states get a lot more business, and Florida has a pretty significant buffer, and it's really no different than what's happening now. So you can see a little bit of the dynamic right there, where Florida has been resistant, but the Gulf Coast states fully embrace it. Now, in the Atlantic, one of the reasons why offshore wind has been moving forward, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. One is you have a really dense population along that coastline, and they don't have a lot of sources of energy. There's been denial and resistance to natural gas pipelines to come up there, and that's really made it hard to get gas to come up there. So you've got a lot of liquid fuels providing power up there, but you have the densely populated areas. Then you have all those states putting in place mandates to procure power from offshore wind. So that is driving investment. That also has driven the federal government to, be more aggressive with leasing and permitting in that area. So the states play a big role, and no matter what kind of project it is, you got the Coastal Zone Management Act, and the states get to weigh in on whether or not they believe these projects and these activities are consistent with their own coastal management plans that are in place. And that could ultimately lead to litigation or things like that. So they have a lot to say, and it means a lot. And the public in those states oftentimes can drive that and persuade those state elected officials to move one way or the other. And that's what we've seen. When you've seen the reduction in lease sales over the last several decades, a lot of that has been based on some of the opposition we've seen along the Atlantic and other areas to oil and gas, where 60s, 70s, 80s, we saw a lot of lease sales in California and the Atlantic coast for oil and gas. We had oil wells, natural gas wells drilled in the Atlantic in the 80s without success. But I would assume that there's a high prospectivity when you get along the Atlantic margin for oil and gas. So it's something that, who knows, down the line, 10, 20 years, we may need to look at.
So, and the other thing, though, that I think is interesting in all that, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, they're not just getting the jobs and the activity associated with all this, but they're also, with oil and gas, they're getting some of the revenues, right? Some of it is happening in their state waters, whereas if you're New Jersey, you're getting the activity and the power, et cetera, but there's no real royalty regime per se, right? It's just not as profitable of activity, I would guess, for the state.
Yeah, you make a good point. And it's interesting because for many, many years, for decades, if you had oil and gas production in an onshore state, that state would get 50% of the revenues, the bonuses, the rentals, and the royalties. Nothing for offshore federal production to those coastal states. Then in 2006, they passed the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, and that included revenue sharing for those four states: Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. So I think there's a cap of around 375 million that they can take in, but those states get 50, 100, 150 million dollars a year for coastal restoration, coastal resiliency, and that's huge. And right now, for wind, the revenues would just go into the federal government based on the way the statute's set up. And for oil and gas, federal revenues in total, about $4 or $5 billion a year. So it's significant. And then you've got about $1 billion that goes to Land and Water Conservation Fund. Then you've got close to $400 million a year for those coastal states through revenue sharing. We have been working with Senator Cassidy, who's co-sponsoring a bill with Senator Whitehouse. So you've got bipartisan legislation there called the RISE Act, which would lift the amount of money the Gulf states could get from oil and gas revenues, and it would put in place revenue sharing for offshore wind states. That seems to be a lot of support for it. It's just something that hasn't made it through Congress yet and to the president's desk, but bipartisan support. So we could see that change over the next year or so, maybe even this year with the permitting legislation. We've been working with Senator Manchin on that as well. They're trying to take the next step to expedite permitting and streamline permitting. We like that because the initial proposal mandates oil and gas lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico at least once a year for the next 5 years, which would help things for our industry.
So maybe tell us a little bit about Washington. This is kind of like Jeff's question, which was a big one in one question. So I'll do a big one in one question. Washington, we're obviously in the election season, but we're also this permitting bill has been kicking around. Maybe we're in a period where some stuff could happen because Biden is retiring. What do you get a sense of people finally kind of coming to the attitude like, what are we doing? We have got to have so much energy and so much power. We have got to stop fighting about flavors. And you're an industry association that has all flavors within it. So you're kind of uniquely positioned to say, can we please stop fighting about flavors? But what's the energy mood in Washington, or is it election season and no one's?
Well, it's both.
Yeah.
It's both. It's election season, so it's crazy from that standpoint. But we've been working with Senator Manchin, Senator Barrasso, the two leading senators on Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. They're trying to get this permitting bill across the finish line. We've been optimistic kind of the whole time, or most of Washington thought it would never happen, but we've seen a lot of traction, and we've seen a lot of Democratic senators coming out in support of this bill already. Martin Heinrich out of New Mexico, I think so, if I have that right. And there are others that have been talking positively about it. So you need 60. If you follow your line of thinking, let's all just be reasonable and make sure we're doing what's best for the country, because the country uses all forms of energy. And by the way, about 70% of that comes from oil and gas, and Gulf of Mexico is a great place to get that. But we're fighting for the 60. We're trying to get the 60. At the same time, we've got the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, Bruce Westerman out of Arkansas. He's working with Congressman Peters, I believe, out of California, the Democrat, to create companion legislation out of the House that would be similar, and it would from there go to conference. So a lot of this is on the table now, and we would likely see the movement on that in lame duck after the election and hope that it would ultimately pass. Now, the debt ceiling bill that was passed, when was that? June of 2023. That's what got kind of McCarthy in trouble, because it was bipartisan legislation, and that was kind of the beginning and the end for Speaker McCarthy. But that had a lot of permitting reform in it based upon Congressman Graves' Builder Act, almost had the entirety of it. But that didn't finish it. One of the areas where we need some improvements are on the timelines when it relates to litigation. You can't wait forever to file a suit. If you sue, the agency's got to have a set amount of time to get it fixed. So there's some timelines that could be put in place through this permitting bill to kind of expedite the battles that ensue after a project gets approved or a lease sale occurs. That would be pretty big. But two of the big things we've been pushing for in that legislation have been mandatory oil and gas lease sales, as well as the wind lease sales. And that's where you've seen on the Democratic side, the resistance coming from the environmental movement, even though as a whole, you see massive improvements to streamlining approvals for the power grid and improvements to the reliability of the power grid, which is really necessary to get all these clean energy projects from the Inflation Reduction Act to work in a successful way. So all these are tied together in the end, and we're hopeful, but a lot of question marks there. I will say, going back, there's a lot of value in trade associations. We believe that when you had in 2021 and 2022, you had a Democratic White House, Democratic House, and Democratic Senate. They have the ability, through what they call reconciliation, to pass a bill with just 51 votes out of the Senate. We thought it was going to happen. Now, they were talking about the Green New Deal. We pushed back on that, or the Build Better Act. It was too punitive. Our whole position was take out the punitive and let's make sure we're putting provisions in there that are enabling and that incentivize and that actually require oil and gas development. So we worked, and if you remember, Lease 257 was something that the administration did because the Louisiana court said you can't do a lease pause, you're violating the law. So they go ahead and do Lease 257, and that was struck down by a court because they felt that they didn't do enough environmental review. So one lease sale the administration had, was forced to hold it, and the court struck it down. So we went to Senator Manchin and said, let's get that reinstated. Let's require this administration to do Lease 259 and 261. That all happened. That all went under the radar. The president and the Democrats, when they were really kind of champion and promoting the passage of that bill, you didn't hear them talking about that. But we had 3 lease sales, each with about 300 leases issued and with about 1.7 million acres issued. That only occurred because of Inflation Reduction Act. That bill as a whole, does it reduce inflation? Probably does the opposite. But as a trade association, we worked with Senator Manchin, somebody out of West Virginia who believes in fossil fuels, and we made sure that we were putting something forward that didn't forget us, because we saw that as a window that was going to close and we don't want to be left out. So now moving forward, we're doing the same thing with this permitting bill to make sure that we don't foreclose any opportunities that could help projects of all energy types by streamlining them and requiring them.
Erik, we've talked a little bit about oil and gas. We've talked a lot about wind, but we haven't talked a lot about carbon capture at this point. And it seemed like pre-IRA and maybe a little bit post-IRA, you had Denbury got bought by Exxon. You got Talos just recently sold out to Total, their position in the Gulf Coast. What is your sense of what's going on in carbon capture right now? Are we moving at all? I mean, is there as much momentum as there was maybe 12, 18 months ago? Where do you see that momentum in the next, say, 12, 18 months from now?
Yeah, I see a lot of momentum, but I'm seeing it more from the onshore side, unfortunately. I want to see it from onshore and offshore. And that's because they have the ability through the state regulatory regime and through the federal permitting to be able to move a lot of these projects forward, with Louisiana getting preemption and getting the ability to approve those projects through, I guess it's the Class 6 EPA regulations, and Texas is getting close, and Wyoming has it. And you have a lot of companies that are moving up, like Oxy and ExxonMobil, and are moving forward with the projects. So it's happening. You kind of would like to see it happening at a bit of a faster pace, but you're kind of at the mercy of the regulators, and the federal government, has not stepped back to the extent you wish it would. Offshore, we're seeing it move forward in state waters. Yeah. If you look at Texas, they have 9 miles. All other states, for the most part, have 3 miles. Goes back to 1953 with the weird way the laws were written, and states opting in and states opting out. Louisiana's actually been looking at trying to get theirs expanded to the same 9-mile limit. So some of those projects, if you look at like Bayou Bend, which is, I guess that's Chevron and Total, that's state waters and some onshore areas where you're in close proximity to a lot of the emission sources, and you're able to now move forward to develop the infrastructure and the the geographic well design and storage sites to get that CO2 to storage. For offshore, the federal government's just been slow as molasses. That law was passed November 15th of 2021. That was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It required Interior to put the regulations in place within a year for leasing and regulation of offshore carbon sequestration. They still don't have a proposed rule out. So we're looking at maybe a proposal by the end of 2024, which is 2 years late and 3 years after that law gave them authority to do it. So you're looking at a potential final rule, maybe 2025, if not later. That's just, unsat from my military days. The government needs to get these regs in place. They need to get the leasing regime in place. It's being done all over the world. Outside the U.S., there's probably 50 offshore projects moving forward. You look at Southeast Asia, you look at North Sea. That's in addition to the hundreds of projects that are happening onshore. I think this is a place where the U.S. can lead. We can advance technologies. We have the engineering brains throughout that whole Gulf Coast, Houston, Louisiana, to be able to do this. But the government is in the way. They're not creating the regulatory system that we need to make it happen. And Gulf Coast, it's perfect. We know the geology. We know that you've got the subsalt, the saline aquifers, and you've got the depleted oil and gas fields, and you've got infrastructure in place, and you've got rights of way. You've got the emission sources along the coastline there, the industrial centers. It is so well suited for this. And you've got the companies who are weighing in. We have a workforce that we put together with the Offshore Operators Committee. We've met with Interior time and time again, so we could bring in the experts from all the companies explaining how this is done and how it can be done safely and how we can have good well integrity. And we're going to be able to keep the CO2 in place and secure. And then you have, like you mentioned, Inflation Reduction Act then expanded the 45Q credit for this. And that's got a 10-year window on it. So we're losing time and opportunity because, these credits may not be in place forever. And we want to make sure that we take advantage of them. So we're bullish on the Gulf of Mexico for carbon sequestration, but we have a federal bureaucracy that's standing in the way of massive amounts of investment that could help us lead the way in the U.S.
Well, as we get ready to close, maybe I'll try to end on a more optimistic note. For your membership, what are you most excited about over the next 2 years? You mentioned the 20,000 PSI projects that just made first oil on. What would be the top one or two or three things that you're optimistic about over the next couple of years for your membership?
I'm optimistic about the Gulf of Mexico, and I think you hit it on the head. We have all these projects that have been sanctioned now coming online, and we've talked about the opportunity for the Gulf of Mexico to continue to increase production and show that it's going to be a region that we can sustain for decades to come. And that's going to happen because the companies have worked together throughout the supply chain, and they're working together collaboratively. They're competitors, but these companies that are bringing these projects online, they're 4 different companies with lots of different partners. They're working together to, make sure that we're promoting safety above all when we put these projects online and get the first oil and see these in place for decades to come. So that's potentially hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil that we're bringing online. And there's a lot more promise beyond that. It's a mature region, but we're at close to the highest level of production we've ever had. That occurred right before the pandemic. August 2019, we had over 2 million barrels a day. And right before the pandemic, we had like 8 straight months of almost 2 million barrels a day. But we've been producing 1 million barrels a day since 97 in the Gulf of Mexico. But it's been a continuous rise in the amount of production. The other area where I see some optimism, and we're not huge in LNG, but the Gulf Coast is going to be a global leader in LNG, and gas is cheap right now. It's $2 per MCF, maybe $2.30 today, and that's incredible considering how much demand has grown over the last several years. When I was at API in my old job, we helped put together LNG allies, which we brought the countries from Central and Western Europe to the U.S. to talk to our policymakers about how U.S. gas is desired. That's what these countries want. And we see Russia invade Ukraine, and we saw it in reality. but there's a lot more promise there as well in terms of building up the Gulf Coast from an LNG standpoint. And who knows? We know the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of gas. It's almost all liquids now, but we're at 5% gas production. We may have been at 15% at one point, but the shales took over. And from a cost standpoint, it made sense for it to be a liquids play. But at some point, you could see the Gulf of Mexico go back and become more of a gas play if this demand for gas, for power, it's at the highest level ever for power demand in the U.S. and globally continues to climb. But I'm bullish on the Gulf of Mexico. I love this industry. It's fun. It's exciting what we're doing out there and targeting these reservoirs with this high temperature, high pressure at 35,000 feet. It's like going to the moon. Houston's the space capital of the world. It's also the oil capital of the world, and it's happening out of Houston, Louisiana. But I'm excited to be a part of it. We've got a great membership. We've got great companies. And I think despite the headwinds that we get from the public policy side that we've been able to battle through successfully, and we still may see more of that depending on how the administration works out based on the election, we're still in a good position with the Gulf of Mexico for continued investment. We still have the leases. Would like to make sure we get lease sales every year. And don't forget, when Manchin put the Inflation Reduction Act in place, he tied wind to oil and gas. If they're going to issue a wind lease, they have to do an offshore oil and gas lease first. So we were surprised that they didn't do more oil and gas leases. But for the sake of both, we have them both tied together. Our wind companies aren't real excited about that. But the good news is we're going to see both. But would like to see more of both. And if even without the rigorous and robust number of lease sales that we'd like to see, we're going to continue to see real strong investment in the Gulf of Mexico because it's one of the premier regions in the world for oil and gas production.
Well, Erik, this has been awesome. The work there you're doing at Noya it's fascinating. It's diverse. It's obviously it's all offshore, but wow, what a playground, as you mentioned. So we consider ourselves lucky to be a friend and get to hear about all this stuff.
Absolutely. Hey, we got football season coming on. Who's your teams?
Well, see, I went to Rice, so now we're getting better, Erik. We're getting better. Coach Bloom is going to turn them around at Rice this year, I feel sure. But I got a tough office because I got an Aggie there in Tillery, and Mike is insufferable. He's a Seminole. So, how about yourself?
Well, I got Notre Dame playing Texas A&M and Florida State this year, so it's going to be a tough year. We're opening up at Texas A&M. That's going to be a tough one, and play Florida State later in the year. So I'm a Pittsburgh guy. So the Pirates have done their thing where they've kept you excited right up until football season starts. Now they've kind of fallen apart, and now we can turn our attention to the football season for the Steelers and for me, Notre Dame.
No, and I got a young son playing football at Stanford, and Mike doesn't believe me, but they're just going to go storming through the ACC this year. It's going to be ugly. I feel sorry for that conference. Mike doesn't agree. Erik, you're awesome. We really appreciate it. We look forward to the next visit. Come see us in Houston. We'll come see you in DC.
Absolutely. Thanks for everything. I appreciate being on, and good luck with everything.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.